Moving into the soliloquy itself, then, I want to just make a couple observations as we get started. First is that I play with my hair a lot when I teach, and you guys don't know that usually because you can't see my face. But now you can, adding some personal touches here in Hamlet Act 3. So moving into this soliloquy, it's kind of just worth noting from the outset that Hamlet goes into some real dark stuff in this soliloquy. And as we've mentioned already, he's in this state that suggests a deep melancholy, sort of a brooding depression that the man is experiencing throughout the play. And this is kind of like the lowest slope for him. By the end of the play, Shakespeare will kind of bring us up a little bit before the conclusion. But this is a time that Hamlet still has to kind of like talk. By the end of Act 3, some of you have already gotten there, an event occurs that will kind of force the play to kind of speed up a little bit. But for right now, Hamlet has this space, this kind of free space to continue philosophizing and sort of working through his big questions. And the big questions that he asks in this soliloquy are like the big questions. It's about existence, it's about being, and it's about the difficulty of being. On one level, of course, it's beautiful to be anything at all. And yet, when life is filled with pain and sorrow and suffering, as Hamlet is currently experiencing, there's a lot of difficulty that is implied in that pain. Hamlet's a thinker and he's a scholar, and he's approaching this question with sort of a philosophical quest for objective truth, if you will. But in that space, he's going to deep dive into some stuff that is really dark. Some of us, those questions aren't things that we really think about. That's not really in the orbit of our thinking. But for other ones, that stuff is like crouching at the door, and it's a regular part of our thought process, which can make reading this a little bit difficult. So I want to say, sort of as a disclaimer, that I recognize that these things that Hamlet is struggling with here, this isn't just a light, airy fiction. This isn't just a nice story. The poetry that's given expression here is meaningful, and it causes difficulty, and it raises questions that some of us haven't asked before, and some of us ask too often. And if you're in that space where this stuff maybe rings a little bit too true, I just want to encourage you to seek out help. If you know people, or if you yourself are in spaces where talking to a counselor, some of the awesome people in the cares department, a teacher who you feel would be able to help address some of those things, a parent, somebody close in your life, I encourage you to reach out to them. One of the things I think that draws us to Hamlet is his loneliness. Like, we know isolation and alienation, and to have a character as lonely as Hamlet and as relatively friendless as Hamlet is in the play speaks to us. But we don't have to be lonely. We all need Horatios. So I'd encourage you, if you're in that space, to find that kind of person and find community around some of these things, dark as they may be. So the question itself is kind of worth noting. I think Hamlet is kind of framing this as like a intellectual query. If he were to walk into a philosophy classroom in Wittenberg, it wouldn't be surprising to have something like this on the board: to be or not to be. That's the topic of discussion for the day. That's the question that we're going to dive into. And Hamlet comes at this with like a scholar's interest. He says, okay, let's talk through the options. Let's consider the best argument for not being. What's the best argument against being? And then Hamlet will flip that on its head and say, okay, well, what's the best counter argument to the best argument for not being? And that's basically what he does here. It's rooted in this subjective experience, but as Hamlet has shown us before, he's kind of willing to operate on these two levels to say, okay, here's a question that comes out of my subjectivity, but I'm going to try to answer that objectively. So interestingly, in this soliloquy, he doesn't talk about himself at all. There's never a moment where he says I, capital I. In the first soliloquy, it's like, it's all about him and his father and his mother and his uncle. In the second soliloquy, it's all about, what a rogue and peasant slave am I. I am a dull and muddy-mettled rascal. All this stuff that he says about himself. What an ass am I. In this soliloquy, to be or not to be, he doesn't mention himself once. And I think this suggests that he's intellectualizing. And if we're watching this with him, if we're seated in the play, the actor comes onto the stage like Hamlet to basically be like, I've never thought about this before. This is a new question, and I'm processing this out loud. And as any time you and I process, if we process aloud or if we process in our heads, we'll dig back through it and we'll say, well, that wasn't good, and I didn't like that so much, or this thing made some sense. And so he's kind of just working through these ideas. And we won't see what he does with these ideas for a little bit in the play yet, but it's worth noting that he's not maybe as far gone as some of his thoughts might might make us think, because again, he's just kind of like working through these ideas. So let's look just at a couple things in the soliloquy before we move along. He puts the question forward about the nature of existence, and you'll see the red here, lots of repetitions about death and sleeping. Death and sleeping is kind of a nice euphemism. It sounds, and that it's an idealized way that when people talk about death, they talk about sleep, or we tell stories about older people who fell asleep and then passed away in the night, and that's kind of a beautiful and peaceful and restful image of death. We wonder if maybe that's a realistic vision of death, but it's a vision of death that's kind of hard to ignore. If you have seen somebody, if you've been at a funeral and it's an open casket, it can look like a person is sleeping. Lady Macbeth thought that, right? She said the sleeping and the dead but are as pictures when she was trying to get Macbeth to put the daggers back in Duncan's chambers. So Hamlet starts here with this very kind of peaceful image of death, and there's almost a longing in it. He says to die, to sleep, and there's a sense of like he can't wait to get to that place of rest and fulfillment. He says it's a consummation devoutly to be wished. In a Renaissance marriage, consummation is when a couple had sex for the first time, and the sense there is that they are now joining together and sealing the pact of their marriage. And Hamlet almost makes it sound like the bride of life is death, and when the two come together, that's like it's sealed, and that's like it's made whole now. The purpose of it maybe has met its match, if you will. And so there's a longing here for death that he puts in the beginning, maybe in the same way that you long to go to sleep later tonight. You know, some of those days when it's like, man, today was horrible and I can't wait to go to bed. Or today was hard and it was hard work and I feel rested now that I'm in bed and I can finally go to sleep. Maybe you have mornings where you wake up and you're like, I cannot wait to be back here again. I sometimes say very nice things to my bed in the morning. Can't wait to see you, pal. You're my best friend. I look forward to returning to you later. And so there's this sense of like, when he talks about sleep, until he mentions this dreaming thing. And when he starts talking about the dream, perchance to dream, what's he talking about now? If you're dead, there's no consciousness, right? And in maybe Hamlet's original vision of this. And now he says, well, if there's dreaming suggests a brain, and a dream suggests life. So he's now wondering, well, what's on the other side of this? Is it just sleep? The extinction of consciousness, or is it something on the other side that involves dreams and all those things? And he'll get there in a second. He says that's the thing that makes respect. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. There's the thing that we hold out for because we don't really know, which is what he'll get to in a moment. It's worth noting that his vision of life here in this part is very negative. He talks about the pangs of despised love, loving somebody, and then them just saying, okay, buddy, thanks, friend. The law's delay, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, it's insults and oppression. He's talking about here just injustice, and he's talking about scorns of time, of just this sense of just waiting and suffering, and the whips and scorns and all this horrible stuff that people work through. And these are passive images. This isn't active living. This isn't growing and nurturing and fighting and loving and empathizing. Instead, it's just kind of like the posture of the victim, which Hamlet seems to clearly identify with here. And while he's touching on things that, systemic injustice, racism, sexism, things that we're born into, homophobia, things that just like they're right around the corner that we don't have any say in. We didn't choose to grow up in a certain society or not a certain society. And he says all that stuff is just there. And why would anyone put up with it? What's the purpose of putting up with it? And at this point in the soliloquy, he seems to be suggesting that death is the preferable option. The image of somebody taking arms against a sea of troubles it's lunacy. I mean, I'm reading this book about the Caesars right now, and Caligula, who maybe you've heard of before, known for his excess, is said to have one point staged a war against the ocean, and he marched his armies down to the ocean to fight Neptune, the god of the sea, and he commanded his soldiers to fire weapons, arrows, and spears and such into the ocean, and then proclaimed his victory and threw a huge feast. It's crazy. It's lunacy to say that, a man has defeated the ocean. And the image that Hamlet conjures up is of this massive wave, this huge tidal wave, and one small little man standing in front of it, thinking he can take arms against it. And so his conclusion so far seems to be that this sleep is preferable. It's super depressing. So here's a picture of my dog Finn, who is sleeping, dreaming perhaps, chasing who knows what in his sleep.